lovely to see you again. It's been a while. I hope you enjoyed that clip. The reason why I put it up was to show you the distinction between the rich and the poor. So we're sort of around about the 12th, 13th century now that we are going to be talking about. So today we're going to talk about what caused the Crusades, what was going on in society in Western Europe at the time that could have prompted such a movement to take place. Well, when we think about it, you know, we can condemn the church for that, and many people do condemn the church for the awful atrocities of the Crusades. But we've got to remember that the Middle Ages had a mentality that we don't have today. And so we're just going to look at a few of these points that people were influenced by and see how, you know, if we can get into the mind of a medieval person, we will be able to understand what prompted the Crusades. So number one, we must remember that because of the feudal system, people were, there was a lot of unrest amongst the masses. Okay, so this unrest was caused because of poverty and because of the fact that there was this hectic, well, you could say it was like a class system. And so this class system caused the people that were at the bottom of the class, the lowest class of all, which was, of course, the peasants, to become very, very restless. There was a lot of warfare going on. The lads were full of a warring spirit. And so because of this, the authorities looked at this and thought, well, what are we going to do with all our young lads who are just out to make war and to fight? And we need to channel this warlike spirit into something more creative and constructive rather than fighting against our neighbors like this. Let's do something. Let's fight against a common enemy. Let's bring Western Europe together. So, of course, the common enemy was, of course, the Muslim people. And so then the next point that clicked the right buttons was the fact that Jerusalem was in the hands of the Muslims, okay? And now Jerusalem, of course, was the center of Christendom. It was, as I've spoke about before, I spoke about the relics. Relics were extremely significant articles in those days, and the church really valued their relics. So if there was a saint that died, they would take one of the belongings and put it in a glass case. It could have been a rib or something, and these churches themselves have become very valuable because they would have had one of the relics of a very important saint. So, but we must remember that what was the best place and the biggest place where there would be relics? Well, it was Jerusalem, of course, and these were relics which belonged to the Christian world. And so, you know, Jerusalem became the focal point, and let's just give these people the incentive to go to Jerusalem to fight a common enemy and to claim back the relics that belonged to Christendom, which was Jerusalem itself. You know, the timing was perfect as well, because the Pope that was in charge was a great orator. So because of this, he would preach this message to the masses. And the message would be, do you like seeing Jerusalem in the hands of the enemy? Wouldn't you? We need to claim Jerusalem back. We need to take the relics back to Christendom. And then he would whip up this frenzy amongst the masses. And this frenzy then, you know, it expressed itself in this hatred of the Muslim people. And so the Pope was named Pope Urban II, and like I said, he was extremely good orator. Now, this was a phenomenon that only took place in Western Europe because the church in the East wasn't up for any crusades at all. They were quite comfortable in their religion. The Eastern Church was busy reaching out to the rest of Eastern Europe with its own brand of Christianity. So they weren't interested in doing any crusades. In fact, they were just keeping their head above water because around them, surrounding them, was the Islamic conquests. So what was really sad of all was the Fourth Crusade was a crusade against Constantinople itself. The Crusaders needed to get to Jerusalem, so what they did was they asked their Venetian neighbors in Venice, who were great merchants, the merchants of Venice, if they could please take them over to Jerusalem on the ships, and they would be paid accordingly for helping the Crusaders to get to Jerusalem. Unfortunately, the Crusaders could not pay the Venetian merchants for this. So they had to try and find the money. So they thought, well, let's go to our brothers in Constantinople. Let's go to the Eastern Church, because the Eastern Church is very rich, very wealthy. Let's go and loot Constantinople so that we can pay the merchants of Venice. So they went over to Constantinople and they completely ransacked the city. And in the process, they murdered and they massacred, and they showed the worst side of themselves that they possibly could show. It was a terrible, tragic thing that brother was killing and massacring brother, Christian brother against Christian brother. And so they looted Constantinople so that they could pay for the crusade that was going to take place in Jerusalem, and totally destroyed Constantinople and weakened it to such a point that eventually in 1400, around 1400s, the Muslim conquest was successful in taking Constantinople. So the tragic thing was that it was the Western Church that came and weakened the Eastern Church in such a terrible way, and it was all about money and debt. So this was a very sad time for the church. So what we can learn from it, though, is that, as I said before, that the enemy's strategy is to divide and conquer. But already the church had split. The Eastern and the Western Church had already had the great schism had taken place already in 1054, and that was over a little tiny clause that had been added to the Nicene Creed by the Western Church without the knowledge of the Eastern Church knowing about it. And the Eastern Church had become very sensitive about this and wondered why the Western Church had actually taken this to do and not even consult them about it. So the little clause that had been added had to do with the Holy Spirit. It was called the Filioque clause, which means "and the Son." So what had happened was that the Nicene Creed had actually said that the Spirit had come forth from the Father. And now what had happened was the Western Church added to the Nicene Creed and said that the Spirit came forth from the Father and the Son. So this caused a complete split. The schism was complete at last between the Western Church and the Eastern Church. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. Their goal was to claim back Jerusalem and to repossess territory which they felt belonged to them. But in the process, their means of doing such a thing were completely anti-Christian and barbaric, to say the least. So we must remember that what we do as Christians, we need to look at our motives. The goal that we are trying to reach might be very Christian and very lovely, but if we're going to use questionable and doubtful ways to get to that goal, then we need to review our strategies. So we must remember that the ends do not justify the means that we use. We need to look at the way that we live our lives. It's rather than looking at the destination, we need to look at our journey that we are taking to reach our destination, rather than looking at the goal and using any means to get to that goal. For that is what the church did at the time. And why did all this happen? Why did the people fall for this? Well, the people fell for it because they were uneducated. They were not versed in the scriptures. They could not read. And so because of this, they were easily manipulated into doing the things that they ought to not have done. Okay, it's from my book by Paul Johnson, History of Christianity, and it's on page 242, and I'd like to just read it to you. It says here, men fought and have always fought. Therefore, war had a place in the Christian pattern of behavior to be determined by the moral theologians. In Augustine's view, war might always be waged, provided it was done so by the command of God. This formulation of the problem was doubly dangerous. Not only did it allow the existence of the just war, it became a commonplace of Christian moral theology, but it discredited the pacifist whose refusal to fight a war defined as just by the ecclesiastical authorities became a defiance of divine commands. Thus, the modern imprisonment of the conscientious objector is deeply rooted in standard Christian dogma. So is the anomaly of two Christian states, each fighting a just war against each other. And so this was endorsed by our theologian Augustine about the just war. The problem is, how does one define a just war? So this is something that we must think about, but we must remember too from whence we have come, and that we are not the great saints that we try and make out to be, and our ancestors in the church are not either. And yet you will find throughout the Christian world, you will find those who really, really loved the Lord and really did serve him. But we don't hear about them so much, although we will hear about them a little later, because those that were actually working from underground, eventually that fountain had to burst out and come to the surface eventually when things got too bad. The Lord, you made sure that the world would see that there was this underground movement that was taking place amongst God's real people. So praise God for that. So we see from out of this movement of the Crusades, although it was extremely controversial, and it was, at the roots, the Crusades was not Christian at all, we find that there was a few orders that actually came out of this movement. The monastic movement, they got wrapped up in it as well, into this frenzy of the time. And so from out of the monastic movement came semi-monastic movements. And these semi-monastic movements were made up of men that were actually knighted, and yet they had taken on a monastic order. And so there was a few of these orders that came into being, and one of them was called the Templars, the Knights of the Templar. And their job was to make sure that they would help the Crusaders, those that were walking and going on foot to Jerusalem. They would stand by and they would make sure that they were protected. And so you had the Knight Templars, and then also another order was called the Teutonic Knights. And the Teutonic Knights came actually out of Germany. And these guys, their main job was to actually bring the Eastern Church back into the Western fold, into the Roman fold. And so they were sent up north to places like Poland and those areas in the north there. And then also you get the Hospitallers. And so the Hospitallers were the ones that actually went along with the pilgrims and with the Crusaders and that, and then they would actually help those that had got wounded on the way. And during the warfare and stuff, they would be there to nurse them and to look after them and to build hospitals along the way to Jerusalem. And so they were also a semi-monastic order, actually bring nursing and to bring recovery for those who had been injured. So that's where we get, like, for example, Richard the Lionhearted, okay? And he went over to Jerusalem and did his warfare as a crusader. and then he came back to Britain and he ruled from 1189 and also became ruler over Normandy as well. So, the world of that time, it was a global movement that took place, was the Crusades. So when we look also at the Templars, for example, I mean, these guys, these knights that took on these semi-monastic orders, they became very famous and they became very powerful. So the Templars, for example, became extremely powerful because they actually went into Jerusalem, and there's many legends and stories about them, and they found where the temple had been situated, and there are stories that they took much of the beautiful temple vessels from underground Jerusalem, and there's stories that possibly they have the Ark of the Covenant, and that there's many different ideas of where the Ark of the Covenant could possibly be. There's some ideas that possibly it's in Ethiopia. Then there's also the chapel in Scotland. In fact, there's a very good book to read. It's called The Second Messiah. It's by Christopher Knight, and it talks about the Templars, the Turin Shroud, and the Great Secret of the Freemasons. Okay, so that is quite interesting if you want to read anything. There's many stories and novels that have been written about the Templars, but a lot of it is totally incorrect, like Dan Brown's books. I mean, you can't build any theories on Dan Brown's books. So the Templars, that there's many orders as well right now in these days. For example, we have the Freemasons, and they claim that they have ascended from that order. And the thing is that they have a lot of secrets in that, which kind of ties up with the whole, idea of temple. And here in London, we have a church that is very ancient. It was built possibly during the time of the 12th century. It's called the Temple Church. Okay, and there, if you actually go to the Temple Church, you'll see the shrines, the crypts and that, with the knights that have been buried there. And it's very interesting to go to. And that was one of the Templar churches that they built very early here in London. So there's a lot of mystery behind the Templars, a lot of mystery behind these semi-monastic orders. Which, for example, we see St. John's ambulance and that. Well, that's named after one of the semi-monastic orders that was in operation during the time of the Crusades. They were called the Knights of St. John, and they were the hospitalers. I don't know how to say it. Hospitalers. I don't know, but anyway, so there was all these different orders and that, and it's very interesting. So what came out of the Crusades? Well, a whole lot of horrible things, really. It was a shameful thing for the church to actually have descended into such an awful activity. But at the same time, the Lord, he's busy working behind the scenes, and this is the beauty of it. He kind of uses the carnal nature of man for his own ends eventually. So what came out of it was a good thing for the poor people and for the peasants, and for the whole feudal system actually was turned on its head once the Crusades were over. Because if you actually survived that, if the men, and the warriors and the knights actually survived such an awful ordeal, they came back home to the West, and they came back with lots of beautiful things, all the looting that they had done and everything else. But it caused them to become merchants and to lift themselves up basically into another class of people, whereby they had their own businesses, and they became able to channel goods that came from the east all the way to the west via new routes that they had created. So Silk Roads and routes from the east came into being because of the pursuits of the Crusaders, which helped Western Europe tremendously, and also brought the poor people out of their poverty. So there was good that came out of it, and it actually helped to erode the whole feudal system and to bring a system that was more fair to each class of people into being. And one of the group of people that did become very rich were the Templars, okay, because of the fact that they were very, very clever at doing the looting, and they kind of seemed to know where to find all the very valuable things. And eventually they became the bankers of the West, which was not really good in the eyes of the king and also of the Pope, because they could see that these bankers, these Templars, were getting too powerful and they were getting too wealthy. And so eventually it was Philip IV of France who took action against them. And in order to pay all his financial debts and that, actually condemned the Templars, and many of them were burnt at the stake and destroyed and persecuted for the fact that they had become too successful and they had become too wealthy. So there were actually 4 crusades, but there was also a 5th one, which isn't really mentioned very often because it had to do with children. Okay, so suddenly, out of the blue, young people and children, it was called the Puri Crusade, that of the children. Puri means children. Whether it was actually children, we're not sure, but whatever it was, there was a lot of young people involved, and they actually had this urge to bring back the Islamic world of Spain into Christendom again. But this all ended very, very tragically, because a lot of these young people were taken into slavery, and they never ever came back home. Many of them were killed along the way, and it was extremely tragic. Many, many people died during this time of this crusade frenzy. And then eventually, looking at Jerusalem, the last crusade was the 4th crusade, and it was taken over by the Mamelukes. The Mamelukes were Egyptians, and they came, and of course then Jerusalem was back in the hands of the Muslim people. So this was the fate of Jerusalem until eventually in 1940. We see that Jerusalem was taken back again and given to its rightful people, the Jewish people, which is still, an ongoing controversy, as we all know all about that. So, this is one other thing. The Crusades still go on in a different format, though. So, as I said before about the relics as well, in the Middle Ages, the church was completely taken and besotted by relics, or rich people used to sell relics to one another. They felt that these relics had a lot of power to them as well, as magical powers. But, we say, oh, that's quite funny, we don't do that today. But actually, yes, we do. The church still operates in this way. And we need to be aware of this, that we have our relics. Example of very, important ministers. They go to Jerusalem, and then they send back little bottles of water from the Jordan. And people have to pay extortionate prices for these little bottles of water, which are supposed to have been blessed. And then they will send back wooden crosses that have been made in Jerusalem and that. And people, they will send letters saying, we will give you this cross. It's got prayers attached to it. And if you donate to our work and stuff, then we will send you these little crosses and things. Well, this is the same as the relics of the Middle Ages. So we need to be aware that we are still very wrapped up. Because what they're doing is actually making out that these things are have magical powers. So we need to be careful of this, because this is not Christian. This is superstition in many ways. Okay, we know about Paul and the handkerchiefs and the aprons that came from him when he had been working as a tent maker. They were nicking these from Paul and sending them to people that were sick, and people were being healed. But it's not for us to actually make this into a regular activity, because soon enough, people that haven't got much information about the scriptures will start seeing magical powers attached to this. So this is the beauty of the fact that we can read the scriptures for ourselves these days. But if we look at the Middle Ages, we know that most of the people that were wrapped up and caught up in the feudal system, especially the peasants, were uneducated and did not have the scriptures so that they could have a standard to live by. They didn't have opportunity to be able to read the scriptures or to know the scriptures, so because of this they could easily be caught up in all these superstitions. And then also we must think about the preaching of Urban II. Do we have this today? Do we have preachers that are preaching very emotional sermons that will whip up a frenzy, and actually it's not scriptural? Well, we must be careful of this, because it does happen in church, whereby I've heard a few sermons where you don't even hear the name of Jesus being spoken. So we must be very careful that our sermons aren't causing us to be manipulated into doing things that actually we can't really afford to be influenced by. So I would just like to leave you with these thoughts, because we can learn a lot from the Crusades. So let us take these things into consideration, and let us prayerfully think about these things. And the beauty of it is that Christ, he is the head of the church, and he knows what he's doing, and he knows our frame, and he knows that we are but just dust. And that is the beauty of it, that he still loves us so very, very much. He loves his church, and he's coming back for a spotless church. Whew, that is something to be seen. It will be a miracle. God bless you.